Hello and welcome once again to the course Life of Christ. We're still in class 9, part C, and we're looking at the introduction to the four Gospels. So we talked about the sources behind the four Gospels. We talked about the canon and the way that different books were chosen to be in the Bible and how those Bibles got to us. We looked at a few of the literary tools that the authors used. And in this particular part of it, we want to look at the characteristics of each Gospel, starting with the synoptic Gospels here. Literally, synoptic in Greek means to see together. You have the syn part, which is together, and then optic, which is usually to see in some form of see, or some people translate it to see with the same view, to see in the same way. And so the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they actually are very similar. They have a lot of the same stories that are chosen, and then even the telling of those stories is similar, which could be partly due to what we mentioned earlier about having similar sources from which they drew, like the source Q, for example. And yet, each of these three Gospels have differences as well, so we'll point out some of those as we go through. Now, John is different in format and content. There's almost no connection between John and the other Gospels. You have the story of the Passion Week at the end of Jesus' life, and you have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And apart from that, most of the stories are different in John. And John is a lot more focused on a dialogue and a lot of long discourses of Jesus, reflections on Jesus and what he meant. So it's interesting to see these four Gospels together. As we talked about in the class on resources, there are books called harmonies of the Gospels, in which they'll either have just the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in columns with just the quotes, the quotations, like, for example, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6 in Matthew, and in Mark, that corresponds to this. And so you can see just the different passages themselves, or you actually have the whole text, where the first column is Matthew, second's Mark, third's Luke, and fourth is John. And as they do that, then it's easier visually to see what material is shared among which Gospels. And many times you'll have the columns of Matthew, Mark, and Luke full of the same stories, and the John column is blank. And then John will have long columns that are full, while the other three are blank. So visually, it helps you understand how the Gospels compare. So A.T. Robertson has a famous one called The Harmony of the Gospels, and I put a couple of others on the webpage that you can also look at or download if you choose to do that. And there's many others as well, but those are some samples of the kinds of harmonies you have access to. Then there's another source I want to mention called the Narrated Bible by a man named F. LaGard Smith. What he did is to try to tell the story of the Bible chronologically. And so you have to, of course, make some choices about when certain things happen, in what order. And some of that's a little bit confusing with some of the stories in the Bible. But for example, in the Gospels, he tried to start at the very beginning. And so he gave the background of, Zechariah there, like Luke does. He gave the background of Mary and Joseph like Matthew does. And so he tried to tell one story, one narrative, taking from all four Gospels and putting them in. And when you'd have one story that's repeated in three Gospels, then he would pick the most complete one and then put the cross-reference to the other two stories out to the side, so that you could continue reading the main narrative. And if you wanted to, you could go over and check the comparison stories to the side. So that's a useful resource. And it does the same thing in Acts, for example. It'll go through and tell, the story of Paul's missionary journeys in order, for example. Then it'll get to the point where it says, and Paul arrived in Ephesus, and then all of a sudden he'll put the book of Ephesus there in the middle of Acts. And the same thing with many of the other letters to the churches that Paul wrote to. So that's an interesting way to go about it. Did the same thing in the Old Testament with the kings, for example, and when the prophets would speak to the kings, like Isaiah speaking to Ahaz, then he would take that section of Isaiah and stick it over in the middle of the narrative of the kings, where it would fit chronologically where it was supposed to go. So that's another interesting resource to use if you can get a copy of that and look at it. Now let's look at the different Gospels one by one, and this will be fairly brief. Actually, this could be hours and hours for each gospel if you chose. You can go and research all of these, but I want to give you a summary of some of the main things that are different or unusual about each gospel and things to be aware of as we read these gospels and use them during this course. Obviously, Matthew is written by Matthew, the apostle, also called Levi in the gospels, a tax collector, probably a man with a gift for writing and organizing things, and so that may have been one of the reasons he was chosen to do this or did it. The date, most people think, is somewhere around 65 AD. Not too long after the beginning of the church, about 30-something years. And obviously while Matthew was still alive. And yet, some authors think before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, because Matthew talks about that event as if it hasn't happened yet. And so that's a possibility for that date before 70 AD. And then the audience that he wrote to, it seems to be the Jews as a people, written by a Jew to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah, while not ignoring the Gentiles either. There are different special themes in Matthew, and I've put the references here so that you can see several examples of each theme if you choose to look them up. Jesus as the Messiah, for example, how he fulfilled the messianic prophecies. 16 different times in Matthew alone, he says things like, this happened to fulfill what the prophet said, and then he would go on and give the whole prophecy or a part of the prophecy that Jesus had fulfilled. So Jesus as the Messiah is a big theme in Matthew, especially since the Messiah is so important to the Jews. Number two there, Jesus as King. And again, you see different references there that emphasize his royal nature as well, even beginning in the genealogies, and we'll come to that later on. We have Jesus third as judges, as a judge. You have parables of the weeds and the wheat. You have the parable of the talents, the 10 virgins, the wedding banquet, the sheep and the goats, all of those implying, Jesus will be involved in the final judgment that comes. Then you have Jesus as teacher. And this is interesting. What you see here are chapter references, not verses, where you have 5 different blocks of teaching in Matthew. Some people wonder if, as a Jew, Matthew was doing 5 blocks to parallel the 5 books of the Pentateuch. And that's a possibility. So you see the Sermon on the Mount, 5 through 7. You see the mission at 10. You see the parables in 13, and on and on. So you have a different theme for each block of teaching. Okay? And then you also have other things that are special in Matthew. For example, there's a great interest in apocalyptic things, things that are kind of unusual, that are expressed differently with different images as well. Talk about the second coming quite a bit. Talk about the events of the end of the world, what the final judgment will be like. And all of those are described with different words and images, as you might have in apocalyptic literature, such as Ezekiel or Daniel or Revelation. So Matthew also has a strong interest in that. Matthew also respects the law, the Jewish law, of course, being a Jew. And he says, especially in chapter 5, Jesus comes not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And we'll talk more about what that means as we get to it. And then Matthew is the only gospel that mentions the church, which is interesting because when Jesus talks about the church in Matthew 18, for example, and you have that if you have a problem with a brother, you eventually take it to the church. Well, the interesting thing is the church doesn't exist at that point. It's still sometime before the church is established at Pentecost. But you have the idea, kind of a foreshadowing of what the church is going to be and to do. Then one of the characteristics of Matthew is that as an accountant, a tax collector, he's probably pretty organized. And so he seems to have things in threes as maybe a memory cue. So 3 messages to Joseph, denials of Peter, questions of Pilate, then 7s, parables or woes. Again, these are ways that the gospel could be transmitted orally, as it was for many years, maybe several centuries, before finally we had the whole collection in the Bible. All right, so those are some things about the Gospel of Matthew that are important to remember as we study that, some background information. Now let's move on to Mark. The author is Mark, the son of Mary, who seemed to be a prosperous woman of Jerusalem. It seems that she's referred to over in Acts 12, when you have the story of the church in the beginning of the persecution against the church there. They're meeting at her house, the house of Mary. That seems to be the mother of Mark, or John Mark. And later on we see that this one also seems to be a nephew of Barnabas. This is the one that's taken along in the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas, and then who leaves Paul and Barnabas and returns back to his home, which causes problems later between Paul and Barnabas. So that's the Mark that we're talking about. And this is also probably maybe a close friend and a lot younger than the Apostle Peter. The date is 55 to 65 AD, and it may be written from Rome, perhaps where Peter was as he was traveling around to help establish the church. This is also one of the reasons why the Catholic Church thinks that Peter should be the first pope, that perhaps he had a large hand in establishing that church. And so Peter's an important figure from them as well. Well, if Peter's there, then Mark is likely there. And it's interesting because his audience doesn't seem to be really all Jews, maybe not even primarily Jews. It seems to be that perhaps he's aiming his gospel more at the Romans. And the way he writes and some of the things he explains seem to have more a Roman audience in mind rather than the Jews. And the date is the earliest of the four gospels at 55 to 65 AD, probably the first gospel written and also the shortest one as well. Okay, now we just mentioned there's several of these. We'll go through pretty rapidly, and if you want to pause and write things down, you can. But as we just said, it's likely the first of the New Testament Gospels written. Number two, it was short, simple, precise, action-oriented. You have words like immediately occurring over and over, straightway, and that would be attractive to the Romans, who are people of action as well. Number three, he used many oral sources, which again is not too surprising, because if he's the first gospel written, and it's one of the first books in the New Testament written, then he's not going to have many written sources from which to draw. Then number four, his purpose is to convince people that Jesus is the Christ, that he's divine, but at the same time human. And so that's a message or a thought that's shared by several of the gospel writers, but it's also there in Mark. Next, he gives details of a witness. And things, you have things in Mark that you don't quite have the same detail in other gospels. For example, it mentions Jesus hugging the children when they come to him. It mentions there was a cushion that Jesus was laying on in the boat when he was sleeping during the storm. Things like that that aren't in the other gospels. So again, it convinces you that he must have been there as a witness for many of these events. Next, it's written it's in Greek, but perhaps some people think it might have been written in Hebrew, that it's much better Hebrew than Greek. And again, we don't know for certain. It probably was in both those languages pretty quickly. And then another thing that Mark does is he translates Aramaic words for non-Jewish readers. So this makes us think it's more for a non-Jewish audience, because why would he translate those if you're talking to Jews? They would likely understand those words already. So likely it's the Romans that are the audience. He also next explains Hebrew customs, which again he would not do if his principal audience were the Jews, but he'd need to do if they were Romans. And then, as I mentioned, there's many eyewitness details. And then there is a great emphasis on suffering and martyrdom. And perhaps he's doing this as a way to prepare the readers to suffer as Christ did. This especially makes sense if Mark is in Rome along with Peter, and it's during the days when the church is beginning to be persecuted severely under emperors like Nero, and many of the Christians or slaves, or maybe slaves who are Christians as well, are having to suffer and maybe die for their faith, that are used in some of the Colosseum games against other gladiators or animals. and they have no certainty about how their lives will turn out, how long they'll live, or how much they'll suffer. And so there's a big emphasis in Mark on this is not easy. You know, even Jesus himself eventually died because of what he was doing, and you might too. So that's one of the things that comes through strong in Mark. And then one other thing to mention that's unusual about Mark is its last chapter, the section from Mark 16:9 and following, could have been added later. It's not in some of the most reliable early manuscripts that we have. And usually, you know, the earlier the manuscript, the more reliable we feel it is. And so that last section from 9 through about 20 is not there. So the question is, what happened? Did Mark not write it? Or perhaps he wrote it, but that part of the scroll was torn off and then found later and added back in. We don't know exactly what happened. But it's interesting to see where the story is left at the end of verse 8 and the end of verse 20. At the end of verse 8, it ends on really a down note, the women going away afraid. And that could have been part of the ending Mark wanted, and say, look, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of suffering, and yet the idea is, you know, everybody needs to continue to carry the gospel forward, as opposed to the other ending, which is a lot more triumphant. Jesus gives, you know, another version of the Great Commission and gives promises about all the good things that will happen from the people who believe, and so that's a whole different ending. But again, that's an unusual characteristic of the Gospel of Mark. Now we go on then to the Gospel of Luke. We have, obviously, the author is Luke, who is a doctor. Some suggest maybe he's even a slave, because a lot of the slaves were doctors who had been taken from other nations by the Romans and forced into slavery and used as according to their gifts or their professions were. So some suggest that. This is the same man who's Paul's companion in Acts. We see him several times there. He's not an eyewitness, as we mentioned, to any of the Gospels, to any of the events of the Gospels. And he is the only author of the New Testament that wasn't a Jew. He is a Gentile, which gives him a totally different background and perspective. The date of his book was likely anywhere from 65 to 80 AD. The favor of the earlier end of that would be, again, the section about the destruction of Jerusalem seems to be in the future in Luke, but it could also be that he reported that as an event that people believed. There's things that they said at that time, but knowing that Jerusalem would be destroyed later, if he wrote it more like 80 AD. And again, we're not certain exactly about that. His audience is Theophilus and the Gentiles. And we notice right away, this is written as the first of a two-part story, with Acts being the second part. This gospel mentions the Gentile and the Roman leaders, which is unusual. They're not mentioned as much in the other three gospels. It uses Greek terms, not as much Aramaic or Hebrew terms, such as teacher. Instead of saying rabbi, it says teacher, a less Jewish term. And it uses less prophecies from the Old Testament, for example, than Matthew, although there are some, for example, in chapter 4, verses 12 through 17, and others. Now, some of the special characteristics of Luke, and again, I'll give you at least 7 here. There's actually one more than the numbers. The first is that it's a gospel of worship and prayer. Shows Jesus praying on many occasions. If you have Mark Powell's Intro to the New Testament, that's an excellent resource, either digital or written. You can look on page 157, and it gives a list of all the prayers of Jesus there. Number 2, it's a gospel of women. You have a lot more women mentioned prominently and favorably than you do in the other gospels. For example, Elizabeth, Anna, the prophetess, Mary, the widow of Nain, the sinful woman in Luke 7, Mary and Martha, the women who followed him and financed his ministry. Just a number of women there mentioned positively by Luke. Number 3, it's a gospel of praise. And if you look at chapters 1 and 2 in particular, you see praise by Elizabeth, praise by Mary, and then others as they go through the gospels. Number 4, it's a gospel of welcome to all. It's not just one group that receives the blessing, it's everyone. And if you go through the stories, you notice Gentiles, Samaritans, women and men, Syrians, Romans, the poor, the outcasts, the tax collectors, the prodigal son. I mean, everybody is welcome, no matter what you've done, which would have been a shock and a surprise, sometimes a welcome surprise and sometimes not, depending on who you were, for those that read it. Then the next one is that Luke shows the expansion of the gospel. And particularly if you take Luke and Acts as a set, then you see the gospel starting out in a very small way in Galilee, and then you go all the way to Rome, the capital of the empire. And so again, the expansion of the gospel, both with number of people and also geographically. Then you have number 6, the salvation of the world. It's a gospel of salvation, and not from sin only. That's one facet of salvation, but also saved from different tragedies or things that are difficult in life. You can be saved from those eventually. And Jesus is the Savior. He's the way in which you can receive relief and salvation in many different circumstances. And then finally, the number 7 that's not on this particular page is that Luke has a significant emphasis on the work of the Holy Spirit, not just in Luke, but also the gospel, or the Acts of the Apostles, where you see many times the Spirit is mentioned by Luke again. So again, a number of things about Luke, very interesting in the differences that there are between his gospel and all the other 3. Then you have the intro to John, finally, the 4th gospel, the most different one, the most unusual. The author, of course, is John, and there's a whole set of resources and research you can do about, which John this is, but for our purposes in this, we're saying this is John, the son of Zebedee, the one that we see in the other Gospels, as well as one of the 12. There's internal and external evidence that convinces me, anyway, that John is the author here. The place of writing in this is likely Ephesus, and it's probably written in the early 90s AD. And so you think about that just for a minute. You wonder how old John was. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but some sources suggest that John was as young as 8 when he was part of the group of the apostles. And part of that really hits us wrong. Think, no, he had to be older than that to be an apostle. How can you have an 8-year-old apostle? We'll talk some about that. But you think about when Jesus' ministry was, it was 30 AD. 30 to 33 is a pretty good guess for that time, maybe a little bit later. And so if John was around as an eyewitness in 30 AD, and then he wrote this in the 90s, and you think back in that time, people didn't necessarily live as long in general, then he had to be pretty young when he was a part of the group of the apostles. And so he's writing with a lot of time to think about what happened in the ministry of Jesus, a lot of time to reflect and to put things together. And so perhaps for that reason, his gospel is so different than the others that were written more immediately after the end of Jesus' ministry. And then his audience was a mixed audience. In some ways, it was for the Jews because he also talks a lot about Jesus being the Messiah. In some ways, it was for the Greeks because some terms like the word logos in chapter 1 really mean a lot more to the Greeks than they would to, for example, a Jew. And so that makes us think there are certain ideas that John put in there to appeal specifically to that audience. And then, other subgroups of those are also ones that can benefit from this. So there's a likelihood it's a mixed audience. Now, one of the questions we have is, what relationship does John have with the Synoptic Gospels? We already talked about how they were very similar and how often John has material they don't have and vice versa. He seems to complement, that's with a PLE, not PLI, he seems to complement the Synoptics where you can fill in a lot of gaps that they don't fill in. As we mentioned before, there's only about 2 or 3 stories that are in all 4 Gospels. The death and resurrection, for example, in the feeding of the 5,000 are in all 4, but besides that, it's pretty different. The Synoptics also tend to concentrate on the Galilean ministry of Jesus, while John tends to focus more on Judea and Jerusalem. and Jesus in those places, particularly in the feast, for example, or the last week or the last night even of Jesus' life. That actually lasts about 5 or 6 chapters of the last part of John. And then as we're looking at Gospel of John versus the other Gospels, one of the most challenging differences between the synoptics and John, they're different chronologies of the Passover week. When the events happened, in what order during that week, seem to be different in John and the synoptics. And perhaps part of the solution is the different calendars, not only with different hours of the day, but also perhaps different ways to consider or call the days of the week, especially with the feasts, for example. And so you wonder, did John use the Jewish system of timekeeping, where the day begins at 6 in the evening and then goes to the next day at 6 in the evening? Or is it the Roman calendar, one we may be more familiar with, where it starts at 12 midnight and goes to midnight the next day? In John 1:39, for example, when it talks about some disciples came and they spent the day with Jesus, that likely refers to the Roman calendar, where 10 in the morning will give them time to spend the rest of the day with Jesus. You jump to John 4, Jesus and the Samaritan woman. When Jesus stops at the well to talk to the woman, and it's about the 6th hour, it would make sense that it might be the Roman calendar, or the 12th hour, but it'd be the Roman calendar, because that would be a good time for him to stop. And it also might be a time when this lady, who was kind of an outcast in the town, could come alone and get water when the other women weren't there. So this one could be Jewish or Roman, but maybe more likely Roman. And then John 4:52 could also be either calendar. It mentions the 7th hour that this son of the official was healed. So that could be the 7th hour, like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or maybe the 7th hour, like in the evening, that evening, or perhaps maybe even 7 in the morning. So we don't know about that one for sure. And then in John 19:14, when Jesus says it was the day of the Passover and he was sentenced, that's probably Roman. He's sentenced after the trial, and it lasted all night long. So if you had to pick one calendar to use, it seems that the Roman calendar of 12 to 12 is the system that John is using, and that could resolve some of the differences between the calendars and the hours of the synoptics and this one. If you talk about the purpose of John, there's several different ones mentioned, but these are the main 4. One is for evangelism, obviously, to talk about who Jesus is and what he does, what he wants. Number 2, he gives the Gentiles a way to convert to Christianity without converting to Judaism. And that's important because that was one of the main fights in the early church, Acts 15. Some were saying, well, the Gentiles have to become Jews in order to be saved. And the consensus after the meeting from the apostles and the church was, no, they don't have to at all. And so John is showing other ways as well, where you can be a believer in Jesus and be saved without being a Jew. Okay. Third, he shows the nature of Jesus through his works and words. And by nature, we not only mean how he was as a person, kind-natured, good-natured, etc., but also divine and human. So it shows that nature through his works and words. And then another thing that was very important, number 4, was to refute false teachings about Jesus from his enemies, such as the Gnostics, who were beginning to come into power and have more influence there the latter part of the 1st century. John is written to say, no, what they're teaching is wrong, and here's the truth about how you need to receive and understand Jesus. So those are some of the purposes of John, and the most famous one, of course, is that you might believe, and that by believing you might have eternal life, there in John 20:31. Now, quickly, we have some important themes in John, kind of like we did with Matthew. And again, you have references where you can check these themes out as we go through. Number 1 is the messianic character of Jesus. Again, Jesus is the Messiah. Number 2, Jesus is the Son of God. not just human, he's the Son of God. Number 3, Jesus is the King. And although this isn't a huge topic, it is an important one. Chapter 6, when they wanted to make him king, and chapter 19, when he's talked about my kingdom is not of this world, Jesus as the King. And then a huge one is the Holy Spirit. And you could actually spend hours and hours on this one just in John. But the Holy Spirit is mentioned 47 times in the Gospel of John alone. You have some of the examples there. That's EX for example, not EX for Exodus. Number 5, you have the signs of Jesus, which are important there in John. And then number 6, you have the importance of believing. 97 times John uses some form of the word believing in the gospel. And of course, the purpose is to believe in Jesus. So again, these are some of the many things that you could say about what's important to John. Then another thing that comes up in John, and again, John in some ways is more reflective than the synoptics. He thinks about what is the nature of Jesus as a person and what's the nature of his ministry. And you have, for example, number 1, the sacrificial lamb, the lamb who dies for the sin of the world. Number 2, you have the temple of his body. So you connect 2 important ideas for the Jews there. Number 3, you have the image of the serpent being lifted up in the desert, and all who looked on the bronze serpent in the time of Moses were saved. Jesus is lifted up on the cross, and everybody who looks on him is saved. And then you have the image of the grain of wheat that has to fall into the ground and die before then it can produce life on its own afterwards. So again, these are just several of many different figures of speech that John uses to describe who Jesus is and what he does. Finally, last slide, and with a little bit of information, but if you want to pause at any time, you can, about Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees. There's quite a bit about it in this book of John. The Pharisees had a number of problems with Jesus. For example, he offended them because he healed on the Sabbath. And we'll see a number of examples on that. They just couldn't understand why he would do that when there's 6 other days you could do that. Number 2, he called himself God and God his Father, making himself equal with God. That's actually said there in John. That's how the Jews understood it. He's saying he's God. Number 3, he said to them that their way of practicing the law was in vain. We talked briefly about this when we mentioned the differences between how the Pharisees and Jesus conceived of the law or thought of the law. Number 4, he said their way of practice. He said he was bread from heaven, and they didn't like that at all. They didn't like he was saying he was anything from heaven. Number 5, he testified that their works were evil, which never makes you popular as well. He called them sons of the devil. Number 6, he didn't fit their concept of who the Messiah was. They were thinking more of a Messiah as a worldly king, and he would say, my kingdom is not of this world. And especially if you're going to come from Galilee and Nazareth, I mean, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can any prophet, come from Galilee? Number 7, he said he was more important than their ancestors and that he existed before them, even Abraham. And they laughed at him for that one. Number 8, he revealed them to be false teachers and neglectful shepherds, liars and evil men. The woes of the Pharisees aren't even in John, and yet he calls them a bunch of different names as well. Number 9, he threatened them with taking away their leadership of the nation. He wanted them to follow the law of God instead of their own traditions and habits. Number 10, he wasn't from this world. And there was a reason why they weren't at ease with him. They thought there's something different about him, not in a good way from their point of view, but it was because, well, he wasn't from this world. Number 11, he said to them, they had never heard the voice of God and his word was not in them. Again, just a terrible offense to people who spend their whole lives studying the word of God and trying to fulfill it. And then finally, he said, they don't even have the love of God in them. So for all these reasons, you can see that Jesus really had a difficult relationship with them, and yet it wasn't all bad. We see some good examples of Pharisees like Gamaliel and Nicodemus during that time. And in general, it's likely that many of the Pharisees understood what Jesus said or wanted to follow him and thought he taught some good things. They may argue with him, but just arguing with him didn't necessarily mean they didn't want him or like him. But evidently there were enough of the Pharisees that were acting or speaking in such a way where we have these passages where Jesus confronts them sharply and says, I cannot accept the way you're talking or acting. So again, you have some background on the Gospel of John. I hope that this quick run through on backgrounds of the different Gospels will help you understand the perspectives from which they write, and then understand better the message of the Gospels as a result. So we'll see you in the next class. God bless you. Have a good day.